In this video, I'll be walking you through how to take your 28 and 32mm models, scale them down to 15mm and get them printed off and painted. Full disclosure, this video was sponsored by Frozen, so thank you so much for your support, but let's get into it. So for this video, I'll be using the Frozen Sonic 8K Mini, which is currently behind me. And this gives a really nice amount of detail and a decent sized build plate as well. So first up, let's walk you through how to actually take those files, put them into your slicer and get them scaled down to 15mm and get them supported. So first thing you want to do is decide on what files you're going to be using. So for this case, I'm going to be using these by Arkville Games. They're these Morio Shock Troopers, which are really awesome. And one thing I would suggest when you're first getting into it, at least, is try to get models that are fully combined. So a lot of them will come in like multi-pose, so they come in different parts, so their heads are not attached and their arms aren't attached, which is fine, but it's very fiddly. If you print them off like that, you've then got to try and glue them together, which gets really, really fiddly. You can combine them as well, so if you're using something like Windows, I believe it's like Windows 3D, and you can combine them in things like Lychee and combine them in Chitubox as well. It's easier. So import your files into your slicer. So for this, I'm using Lychee Slicer because I pair that one up with the Sonic 8K. Okay, and there we go. So once they're all imported, you're ready to start doing your thing. Another note is that you don't want to be using pre-supported files for this. When you go below, I think it's about 20% scaling, things will start to go wrong. So you want to make sure you get the unsupported files for this. It's going to make it much easier. So first thing, select all of those and then you want to rotate them. So general rule of thumb is I tend to rotate them so they look something like that, which seems to be just a general rule of thumb when it comes to 3D printing and doing your own supports. And once they're there, we're going to work out the scale. So in your slicer, head on over to where it says scale. So to work out your scale is actually really easy. Just do a very quick and simple sum. So what you want to be doing is going by the scale that you want to achieve. So in this case, 15mm. So we go 15 divided by the scale that these are, which are 32mm. So 15 divided by 32, which gives us 0.46. And if you times that by 100, you'll get 46, which is 46%. Well, 46.8. So in this case, we're going to round up. So normally we would then change this bit here to 47. And that will then scale them to where we want them. In my case, I'm going with 53. And the reason why I'm going with 53% is they're just a tiny bit bigger. So it gives me a little bit more detail for things like role-playing games and stuff like that. And also when I first did this, I made a mistake in the scaling and I want to keep everything consistent. Now, a really helpful tip whenever you are doing any kind of scaling is always have a reference mini. So in this case, I have this Jungle Fighter that I always use. So if we import that, and the reason you want to do this is when it comes to 3D printing and just miniatures in general, scale kind of gives a reference, but it's never exact. So some creators will make their miniatures just a little bit bigger than like a 32mm or 28mm. Some of them will make them a little bit smaller. So you want to try and find something that's going to give you some consistency. This is also really helpful to use if you're doing things like buildings or vehicles and you want to keep them all a consistent size. So for example, this guy here, this is the one that I know, it's always what I refer back to. If I scale him down to 53%, I want to make sure that he is as close as possible, or the ones that I'm going to be printing, as close as possible to him. So now when I zoom in, I can now put these side by side, so, and get an idea. And just eyeballing it, you can then tell actually they're going to look consistent when I have them on the battlefield and when I printed them all off. So you always want to have that reference mini. You can use that in things like FDM printing as well. So if you've got some buildings that you want to compare it to, you can scale those down. That's where this next tip is going to come in handy. You want to note down all of your different scales. So for infantry, I pretty much always go with like 53%. For buildings, I tend to go for about 55% when it comes to scaling from 32mm. And for vehicles, it really depends. It's always worthwhile, again, putting them next to a reference mini, so that way if you want a tank, for example, you probably don't want to scale it down to 53% because the tank will look relatively small. I mean, they always have that issue on the battlefield. Tanks tend to look relatively small compared to the infantry, but because we're scaling things down, you can then have a grander, bigger tank, which is always nice. But you want to compare it in your slicer, and this is the way to do it. Okay, so we'll remove him because we're not printing him. And at this stage, we are pretty much good to go. However, we want to support them. So I always do it the lazy way. I just go through auto support. I put them on light supports unless I'm doing something larger. So if I was doing something like a tank, for example, maybe a building or a bit of terrain, I would then use some medium supports. But in this case, I'm going to use light supports for any infantry that I do. The reason being is if you use medium support on infantry, it becomes really difficult to get those supports off because obviously you're going with this really fine, small detail stuff. If you go for larger support, it's very difficult to get them off. You'll end up breaking the little minis. If we go with light support, it tends to be a really nice, easy job just to break them off those supports and then get them sorted. Once you've done all your light supports, you are now ready to arrange them on the build plate, hit slice and save them onto your USB and then stick them into the printer. So we'll move on to the next stage now and I'll show you how to basically get them off the printer and then start breaking them off all their supports. So obviously take your USB, get your printer running and let it do its thing. The great thing about 15mm models is you can print off absolutely loads of them and they print off really, really quickly because obviously they are a little bit shorter. So it normally only takes like 1 to 2 hours to do one print job, and in that print job you'll get off loads of different minis. Once it's finished, you just go through your usual stage of taking them off the printer and getting them off the build plate. At this stage, just scrape them off and get them ready for the cleaning process. Now, one thing that can be a bit of an issue is they will sometimes fall through like the netting. If you're using a wash and cure machine, some of them have like larger cages that they go into. So what I tend to do is I normally make sure they just about overlap when I'm putting them onto the build plate, so that way they come off in this big mass that then sits in there. I don't have to worry about them too much. Depending on the type of resin you use, once you've got them all cleaned up, you then need to break them off the support. Now, normally if you've used light supports, this shouldn't be too much of an issue, but it is worthwhile just being cautious with this. Some of them will have absolutely tiny little fiddly parts there, so make sure you either get a scalpel or get some clippers and clip around any of those small delicate parts first and then break them off the supports. So however you do your curing, whether or not you use UV machine, you stick them in sunlight, get them cured up, and then you are ready to move on to the next stage. At this stage, you're ready to glue them together and get them onto their bases, and once that's taken care of, it's time to move on to getting them primed. Now, originally I used to just prime them white because I felt you would be able to get more colour, it makes it pop a lot easier, but I learned from my mistakes, so learn with me as well. I now go for a zenithal prime with this like I do with my larger models. And basically what that means is you prime them all black first and then you hit them from above with a white or maybe a light grey. Using an airbrush is the easiest way in my opinion to do this, but because they are so small you can also brush prime them as well. The reason why I go with zenithal prime is because they are tiny and they're really, really fiddly. So actually if you just go with white, your brush kind of has to touch every single bit. It's not too much of an issue when you're going for just one single colour on these, but sometimes it can be really hard to get in like under their armpits and stuff like that. And that's why I really like going for a zenithal prime, because it leaves that nice dark underneath it, which just looks like shadow, means you don't have to get into those really fiddly parts. Once you've got them all primed, one of the great things about painting 15mm models is one of the things that normally puts people off straight away. When you look at how tiny they are and how much detail is still on there, it can feel like a really daunting thing, like you've got to have really, really good brush control. But actually, you could be one of the worst painters in the world, and it doesn't matter too much with these. Realistically, you only need to get like 2 or 3 colours on these, and how I work it is I'll go for one block colour first, which can be like the main colour that is all over these. So all these like Archville and Game ones, I was using like Gargaric Sewer, which is basically this browniness that goes all over them, and then I went back in there and picked out a couple of details. For these, I did things like the shoulder pads and the helmets, and I went for this like off blue type thing, and it blended a little bit too much. I'm going to go back in there with a red for all of their weapons. And ideally what you want is you want that main block colour on them, and you can just take pretty much any big old brush, slosh it all over them, and then go back in there and just pick out a couple of colours that will just make them stand out as units on the battlefield. Now, I do recommend using something like contrast paints or speed paints, and the reason for this is because it takes care of pretty much everything, so you'll get your shade in there at the same time. If you go for your standard block colours, you're probably going to have to go back in there and just do some more detail work and try to highlight, and it gets a bit funny. So I really like using contrast paints and speed paints for this. It just does a really good and fast, efficient job. Once I've got all my colours in there, I'll go back in there with a dry brush, and that just helps to pick out some of those details, gives them a bit of a dusty look as well, especially if they're these like battlefield type units. I just think it just completes them very nicely. You can go back in there with a wash, which I did, so I went back in with an oil wash over all of these, and it just makes them really nice and grimy, but again, it depends on what sort of look you're looking for. If you want them to be a little bit more brighter, and you don't want to kind of dull them all down with a wash, then obviously you can skip that stage, but that's pretty much how easy it is to do it. Take a couple of colours, you want one main block colour, and then pick out some detail with one other colour, and then either wash them, dry brush them, finish them off how you like. You do not need to go mad with 15mm models. Because they're so small, ultimately you kind of want your regiments to stand out together, and then maybe if you have a command unit or something like that, you can spend a bit more time just adding more detail on it. But the great thing is, you don't need to go crazy, and you don't need particularly much skill or brush control to pull this off. And that is pretty much it. We now have our 15mm models all printed, painted, and ready to play with. Like I said, the great thing about 15mm models is you can get so many of them done very quickly. Like literally to paint up this regiment only took me like half an hour just to get the paint down and then do a couple of extra bits of detail on there. So when it comes to this, you can print them quickly, you can paint them really quickly, and then you have so much more space to play with as well. Rather than taking up like a massive battlefield, you can have that really large scale, like epic size battlefield on something relatively small. So if you're limited for space or you just want grander scale of stuff, honestly, 15mm has been so much fun to play with. So I hope that video has helped you. If you've got any questions about how to go through the printing process, any of the painting bits as well, throw them down in the comments below. And also feel free to head on over to my Discord channel. We've got a dedicated part there for discussing 15mm stuff as well. Seems to be really popular. A lot of people are really enjoying it. And thanks so much to Frozen as well for sponsoring this video and just helping me to bring this project to life. If you're interested in any of the stuff that I've been using, like the Frozen Solid 8K Mini or the resin that I was using as well, then I'll have those bits linked in the comments below. Thanks again for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.